So before we get started talking about the layout of a dovetail, I figured it probably would be good to talk about a little bit about the anatomy of a dovetail. If you see these guys right here, those are the tails. That's actually what gives this joint its structure. The fact that these are angled and the boards are coming together at 90 degrees or some variation thereof, that's what gives the joint its strength. The fact that they're angled in towards each other, and this piece, which is coming from another board, is locked in place. It means that this joint can't come apart except for pulling it straight out. A lot of old drawers and older furniture are made with dovetail joints, and they tend to last much longer than the glue that holds them together. These little bits on the outside, those are half pins. They're not half pins because they're half the size of a regular pin. They're half pins because they have just the one angle. There are other ways of cutting dovetails where there's half tail on the outside, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. If you have questions about that, you can always ask, and I can try to get you an answer. This is marked tail. You'll know more about that in a couple minutes. But this is the tail board, and one important thing to note, which I don't cover in a later video, is, or I kind of gloss over in another video, is it is very important to get these angles going in the correct direction. So I'm going to be removing this half pin, this full pin, and this half pin. If I have these angles going the wrong direction, this joint is actually going to want to force itself apart instead of hold itself together. So, in a later video I'm going to say that you want these outside ones to angle in. That's pretty important. I'd like to start from one side and mark all the ones going in this direction first. Then I like to come and go with all of them going this direction. And they alternate. So this one's angled down and to the left. This one's angled down and to the left. This one's down and to the right. This one's down and to the right. If something's awry in the center area, if I have a wider panel and these two are parallel to each other and not creating a trapezoid here, then I know I've done something horribly wrong and I need to look at my layout lines again. So with that, let's get started with layout. Alright, so we're going to talk a little bit about dovetail layout. There's a couple of different ways that you can lay out dovetails. There's a method that I prefer, and then there is the mathematical one, which can be confusing depending on how long you've been out of high school math. But the easiest way to do dovetail layouts would be to find the center point. I've drawn a 4-inch board here, so I'm just going to put a mark at the 2. That gives me my center point. And I know that I have a 1/4-inch chisel, but I don't want to have the point down here be 1/4 of an inch. I need it to be a little bit bigger. So I'm actually going to make this top space for the pin be 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to measure 1/8 of an inch on either side. I'm doing layout for 2 dovetails. On a board that's this wide, 2 dovetails is good. I'm actually going to go with 1/2 of an inch just because it'll be easier to see. So I'm going to lay out 1/4 of an inch on either side of my center line. And I know that I want my half pins on these sides to be at least 1/4 of an inch for structure. I prefer if they're close, if not the same size as this center pin. So I'm actually going to go with 3/8 on either side. Yeah, there it is. Then I can take, normally it would be my square, but in this drawing world, I'm going to use my angle finder, my T-bevel, and make those scribe lines all the way across. Alright, that gives me my lines that I know that I need to follow with my saw going all the way across the grain. When we get to the actual board and doing layouts, then I'll talk about these angles. But there's the easiest way. On a narrow board, just find the center point and measure on either side. I'm going to show you my preferred method here in a minute. Let me get set back up. So the last way I showed you is good if you're just laying out 2 dovetails on the end of a board. This way is a little bit easier if I'm trying to make a larger panel that I'm going to be having many dovetails on. Another way that you could divide this, other than the way I'm just going to show you, is you can take the width of your board and divide it by the number of tails you want, and that gets you pretty darn close. But I know that it's been a while since I was in high school math, and so sometimes the best laid plans using that math don't go according to plan. So I just prefer this method. Some people prefer to do the math, which is great. But my way is using a set of dividers. This is a really old set that I found somewhere in my house. You can get these at woodworking stores. You can also use a compass or a drafting set. I like these ones that have the wheels. I also like the ones that have the little swinging arm, the old-fashioned dividers. Actually, I'd prefer a set of those, but I haven't been able to find one. Alright, so the way that I start these is I set this to approximately whatever dimension I want my pin to be. So I'm going to take and use my ruler and set this about where I want it. It's a little too wide. I used to have a compass that had a pencil, but that thing died, so I'm stuck with the taped version. That's pretty darn close to the 3/8 that I want. So what I'm going to do is, using the wing, this wing, on this far edge, I'm just going to set the wing on the edge and make a mark. Then I'm going to come to this other wing and do the same. So I'm going to set this wing on this side and make my mark. Normally I would just be using the extra point and be digging into the wood itself. I'll show you when we go to lay out the actual board what that looks like, and I would be making indentations to show you what's going on. With this, I'm using a pencil. So now that I've got my 2 half pin lines laid out, now what I need to do is I'm going to approximate, and I'm going to pinch my fingers, I'm going to approximate the size of the pin in the middle. The way I do that is I take, and using the pencil or the other point in that one, I kind of go a little bit over center line. Then I take and set my divider on the line, and without making a mark, I take and step this off. So as you can see, I didn't quite make it to that other dovetail, or that other half pin mark. Now what I want to do is I need to take and expand this a little bit. It'll make sense in a minute. So I need to expand that a little bit, and I'm going to start stepping this off again. Again, not leaving any marks. There, I landed almost right on that line. If I used that setting on this divider for 2 tails, that means that the center pin is only going to be as wide as the saw curve on my dovetail saw. Those are miserable to fit, and if you're starting out with dovetails, it is not a fun experience. Even for those of us who have been cutting them for years, they can be a pain to fit. So I want to go a little bit bigger than that. So I'm going to just set that on there, widen it a little bit, go the other way, somewhere in there. Now I'm going to take and set it down, take it and flip it. Now I can see that I will have a little bit of a gap in here. That would be great. That's not a bad half pin for the center, or not half pin, full pin for the center. I prefer if my half pins are the same size, generally, as my full pins. So I want to expand this just a little bit more so that when I step this out, this wing is touching that line. So I know I need to go a little bit further out. Just a skosh. And there we go. Lands perfectly on that line. So now what I'll do is I'm going to erase those marks. Generally, when it's on the wood, I wouldn't be leaving any marks, and then I can start poking down into the wood. But now I'm going to just take and draw the mark, come to this side, draw my mark, and then I can come in with my square, and those little depressions are going to make it easy for me to align my square. I'm going to just drop my pencil down into it and slide my square over, and then I can draw my lines. And there we go. There's the easiest way for me to lay out my dovetails. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the angle that you need to cut your dovetails at. They have numerous jigs out on the market that you can buy that have ratios on them that give you a preset angle. Those things work great. But if you don't happen to have one, I'm going to show you how you can figure out how to use your sliding T-bevel, this guy, to help lay out your dovetails. So, I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to make a couple of measurements. There are several different angles that you can use, and they're all going to barely fit on this piece of paper. But one of them is 1 to 6. That, all right, that's what I can do. 1 to 6. I use that mainly for softwoods. The videos that I'm making, all of my dovetails are cut to the 1 to 6, just because it's easier to see that there's actually a slope going on. But usually you're going to use that for softer woods, not necessarily a soft wood. There's 1 to 7, which is pretty universal. And then 1 to 8, which is going to be a whole heck of a lot as steep. Focus. Come on, focus. And this one is more for harder woods. So I've got my 1 to 6 line. I'm going to make my 1 to 7 line and my 1 to 8 line. You can have a chunk of wood that has these ratios on it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure 1 inch over on my paper. Up here at the top. There we go, there's 1 inch. Now I'm just going to take my ruler and connect these lines. That's going to give me the angle that I need. If you want, you can figure out what the angles are on there using trigonometry. it's been a while since high school math, so I'm going to pass on that. So there is my 1 to 6. I'm not going to mark it because that's going to get confusing. Here's my 1 to 7 line. There's my 1 to 8 line. I personally have a dovetail marker that has both 1 to 6 on it and 1 to 7, which makes my life a whole lot easier. But again, if you only have this guy, then this is one of the easier ways of handling it. Now what I can do is I can loosen my wing nut and set my angle to whichever one I'm going to be cutting. So 1 to 6. And lock that down. And there we go. Now I have it set to the angle that I want to cut my dovetails to. So now we're going to talk about the actual layout on these pieces. As you can see, I've written tailboard or tail and pin. That way I know which one's which. I know that my handwriting is going to be on the outside of my pieces. That's not super critical here when we're working on practice dovetails, but when I get into my project, I want to know which ones are receiving the tails and which ones are receiving the pins. If I don't pay attention to that, I might not be able to get my project to go together. So it's important to have these marked. My first step is going to be to scribe my cut depth here up at the top of both of my boards. On the tail board, I'm going to scribe across both faces and both edges. On my pin board, I only have to scribe across the faces. So when I am using my marking gauge, I have it set to just a little bit further than my board is. It's actually a little too far. That made it worse. That's a little bit better. The more material I leave sticking proud of the surface, the more I will have to trim on an actual project. So now that I've got the depth set, I'm going to take, and I like to pull my marking gauge. There are some people who prefer to push. I find that I have more control if I'm pulling my marking gauge. So I'm going to do a light pass at first to just start scoring it, and then I can start getting deeper and deeper. If I try to take it all at once, I run the risk of it wanting to wander on the end or the edges. Sometimes it's easiest, especially on a super narrow board, just to roll the marking gauge. On something that's about this wide, these are about 5/8. I don't mind pulling it. If my board is super thin, I can hang it off the end of my bench, or the edge of my bench, to get these marked. Alright, so that is my tail board marked. Now I'm just going to mark those faces on my pin board. Can't really see them, so I'm going to try to make that a little darker. In the lighting in this shop, I'm going to have to put some pencil in those knife lines, just because I can't see. So I can do that now, or I can do that once I get into the vise. So now I've got my scribe line. I'm going to go ahead and clamp this tail board in the vise. The dovetails that I cut are tail first, so that means that I'm going to be cutting my tails, and then I'm going to be laying out my pin board based on my tail board. So I'm not going to lay them both out at the same time. I'm going to lay my tail boards out, cut them, get them clean, then I'm going to come over to the pin board and using this board, lay out the pins. You can do it the opposite way around. I just find that it's a whole lot easier to mark the tail board onto the pin board than the pin board onto the tail board. All right. So now that I've got my board clamped up in my vise, I made sure that when I was clamping it up, that the writing or the outside of the board was facing towards me. Again, these are practice dovetails. It's not super critical whether they are perfect or not, but I prefer to be consistent. That way on my project, I know that the outside of my box is facing towards me, and I don't really have to worry about a whole heck of a lot. So let's get this moved. So now I'm going to be laying out my dovetails. I'm going to use the divider method that I showed you earlier, so I'm not going to go really in depth, but I'm going to show you that you can see those little dimples that I was telling you about. So I've set this to my half pin width. So referencing off this side of the board using that wing, I made a pretty deep indentation. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So now I'm going to kind of just eyeball where I think the pin's going to land. Let me get a little bit of lead or ink in those little depressions, so maybe you can actually see them. There we go. So now I think that's approximately where I want it. So I'm going to take and set this wing inside that half pin mark and step this out. Don't make any depressions yet. And as you can see, it's actually sticking out past the board. So I adjusted this a little too far. That's really easy to fix. Just a little adjustment. Keep in mind I stepped this out twice, so it's twice the amount of adjustment per turn. And now I can start again. So still not leaving a mark. I'm going to take and rotate this. And it's almost there. I'm just going to bring it in just a little bit more. Sorry, there we go. And this should be it. Or not. There we go. So now this wing is hitting over here. So now I'm going to start again. I'm just going to drop that back in that mark. And now I'm actually going to take and dig that down into the wood, pick this up, and go from this point over. If I have a board that's 8 inches wide, I could step this out and make a dent like that, rotate this, make a dent, and just keep going down the line. All right. Where did that pen go? There it is. All right, so now that I've got my indentations where I want my pins to be, and you can kind of see them, I can take my square and mark those straight across. So what I'm going to do is drop that pen in that divot and draw my line across. I'll make sure that they go all the way across. Ta-da! There we go. So now I need to mark those vertical lines. I'm just going to use this. I want to make sure that when I'm laying out my dovetails, that this one on my far right angles in towards the center, and so does this one on the left. They need to angle in towards the center, and they're going to alternate back and forth every other one. If you start with this one angled out, your dovetails are going to be the complete opposite, and they're actually going to want to shove themselves apart instead of holding themselves together. So I'm just going to take and mark these guys. I like to do all of the ones that are angled this direction first. So I marked this one, so I'm going to skip this one and move on to the next one, which is going to be angled the same as this first one. It just helps me keep track of where I'm at. Now I can flip this around, and again, I'm starting from this side. And going every other one. All right, so I've actually got everything marked out, and you can see I have these relatively tail-looking things. What I'm going to do now is mark my waist incredibly well. That way I know which side of the lines I need to saw on. Also, I know what chunks of wood I need to remove. So if I don't actually mark my waist, even though I've been cutting these for years, sometimes I accidentally cut off those parts that I want to keep. So it's nice to get in the habit of just marking clearly. If you need to have a red flashing light saying don't touch this, or not don't touch this, but remove this, you can use a red Sharpie and color in your waist. I just find that some X's remind me, cut this. If you start marking what you want to keep, then sometimes your brain gets confused and you accidentally cut away what you want to save.